But let me also start with a couple of introductory words. First, again, words of thanks as well. I myself have formal training in sociology and political science, as do the two gentlemen on the podium. But in addition to sociology and political science, I have been engaged in research in STS for about 20 years, and this has been a very stimulating experience, not least, or one highlight of it, when I met Sheila about 10 years ago, and I'm very grateful for her collegiality and also invitation to take part in her networking activities. What I would like to add in response to the first session we had, Ted brought up, or Sheila brought up in response to Ted, an observation that what is like a driver in science for interdisciplinarity, and that the place where I'm working right now, at Aachen University, which is one of the engineering powerhouses of Germany, there I've learned that in engineering, interdisciplinarity is not really a big deal. Not least, and this is another aspect, because many of the engineers who do research and teach there have a background in industry. And obviously the culture of doing projects, of doing R&D, is very much interdisciplinary and not limited to basically the classic disciplinary setup that you can find at many university faculties. Often also, of course, they have more funds available than the humanities and social sciences, and that makes it probably also easier to be more open. At the same time, I came there a year ago from the desert of Arizona, but I don't want to further expand on those metaphors, although it has rained in Aachen in fall a lot. And Arizona at the same time, ASU is not, I mean, it's like a fertile ground in the midst of a desert, and especially of a political environment which you could also describe as quite disastrous often times. But now I'm engaged in a new emergent field which is called Future Studies, which allows me to promote SES in a national context of academia, that is the German context, which in many ways is institutionally like a desert for STS research. So the title of this session is STS, Politics and Public Management, Disaster and the Politics of Intervention. And this is clearly the longest title of this workshop. And it's probably the title among the sessions we have today that least points to academic disciplines. Politics in the UK, there are departments called politics. In other countries it's more political science, and public management is also like a hybrid constellation of public affairs and public management. So you both have like the academic side and the real world side of decision making and acting on problems, and the question being, what does STS have to contribute? So this session really brings up the question of critical analysis, analytical capacities, as well as capacities to practically engage. And in the beginning we're also talking about ages we are living in, and we could also say that we are living in an age of, I mean, full of or rich of disasters, both natural and man-made ones. Often they are reinforcing themselves, and many examples come to mind. The latest ones being the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown in Fukushima. The war in Libya is also another kind of disaster, at least also when looking at the backdrop of the recent wars in Iraq and elsewhere. And the politics of intervention, at times trying to control, to solve problems of disaster, but at the same time often also actually creating or enforcing aspects of disaster. And obviously the person who wrote up this title must love complexity, but I would now like to ask our two speakers to try and help getting this complexity under control. First, we'll have Andy Lakoff, who just published a book on this topic, who will talk more briefly, and Alan Irwin will then expand a little more with critical comments. So maybe each of you can also say a couple of introductory words how you got to this and what your personal, both analytical and practical engagement with this topic is.
Sure. I also want to begin by thanking Sheila for including a panel focused on disaster and helping to launch this edited volume in this conference, and for Alan as acting as a discussant. So I want to just quickly introduce this edited volume Daniel mentioned that came out last year, and that I had begun putting together a few years before while working as a fellow at the Social Science Research Council. The process of producing this volume on disaster has itself been punctuated by a series of disasters that you all know about. When it was originally conceived, we were in the wake of Hurricane Katrina and urgently preparing toward a possible outbreak of pandemic flu. As the volume went into production in 2009, we were in the midst of a global financial meltdown. Upon the book's release last year, the Deepwater Horizon disaster was at the center of public attention, and I was asked to try to write some editorials relating the book to that. And of course now, as we're launching the book, we're still reeling from the repercussions of the recent earthquake, tsunami, and potential nuclear meltdown in Japan. And as we think about this series of disasters over the last decade or so, we can realize how both intense and evanescent the public attention to these events tends to be. And I want to suggest that one effort that this volume undertakes is to reflect on what brings these different sorts of events together, and of course what kinds of interventions STS as a discipline might be able to make to thinking about these events. So I want to just quickly say a few words about the context of the volume's production, its intended audience, and the kind of intervention that it's hoping for. It's not in any way an explicit STS book, but it does try to bring some insights from STS to bear on problems of broad concern in what the conference program calls the field of public management, which I should say is not my own field. I'm trained as an anthropologist and teach in a sociology department. This is actually a very slim volume, as you can see. Too slim to bear responsibility for bringing you all here. But it's a volume that has some fairly large ambitions that as Alan will hopefully be too kind to say, it probably fails to achieve. Perhaps the failures in the experiment will be more interesting than what a more successful variant would have looked like. And so the volume is experimental in two senses, both in the public that it sought to reach through its form, and this will point toward the thinness of the volume, and in the conceptual connections that it sought to develop in its content. And I think in terms of the question of STS and its publics, it's worth reflecting a little bit on how this book came into being. It was commissioned as part of a Social Science Research Council book series sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation on the theme of the privatization of risk. And the effort of the series was to bring recent insights of the social sciences more generally to bear on debates over the role of the public sector in the management of collective risk. As the editors Jacob Hacker and Craig Calhoun put it, to analyze the social and economic effects of efforts to replace public institutions with market mechanisms, shifting the burden of risk to those without substantial private wealth. So there was an explicitly public and political goal that structured the type of volume that was to be produced. And the premise was that relatively short books, 150 pages or less, targeted to a general audience, could potentially influence policy discussions in fraught areas, especially domestic policy debates around healthcare, pension reform, and financial regulation. So these were to be very cheap books. This is, I think, a $12 book, and when it was released, it was on sale for $10. Copies were to be sent to congressional staff members. Funding was available for book launches, which we've taken advantage of here. So the experiment was in form as a means of generating a different public for social scientific expertise, and this led to the structure of the volume, 5 fairly brief and synoptic essays by leading thinkers in the field. But then the question arises, what field exactly? And here I think is where the volume is experimental in a second, more substantive sense, and why it turned out to be something of an outlier in this SSR series on the privatization of risk. So rather than focusing on US policy debates in a fairly circumscribed arena like pension reform, the volume is rather expansive in its topics, covering the problem of disaster in areas from terrorism preparedness, natural disaster vulnerability, pandemic response, climate change mitigation, and humanitarian emergency. And again, moving away from the avowed aim of this series, beyond the need for governmental intervention to mitigate disaster risk, to share the burden of risk, the volume poses the question of how one might design successful interventions to mitigate risk. And here, I think some lessons from STS distinguish the volume from contributions within established subfields like the sociology of disaster, whose oft-repeated, if not yet learned, lesson is disasters are not just natural, but are also social. So the sociology of disaster typically focuses on ways that structural inequalities in access to resources, in education, in mobility, exacerbate human vulnerability to disaster. And alongside engineering disciplines, this social science of disaster has become a somewhat standardized element in a domestic and international disaster management apparatus, often instructing public authorities on things like public risk communication and how to coordinate a response among disparate governmental agencies and local groups. In contrast, the varied contributions to this volume, especially through their juxtaposition, do not take for granted the question of what the category of disaster refers to, or what might constitute inadequate intervention to mitigate risk. More specifically, they don't take for granted a distinction between the technical and the social aspects of risk governance, but try to describe design solutions that might integrate both of these dimensions. So, for example, in a chapter she wrote on technological or on natural disaster vulnerability, Sheila points to the failures of purely technocratic management of potential catastrophe and the need to develop what she calls technologies of humility that admit to the limits of calculation and are thus open to contribution from a public that has its own experiences and understandings of the potential for harm. And in his chapter on the construction of a European carbon emissions market, Donald Mackenzie shows that crucial technical details, such as a mechanism to correct for overallocation or a standardized system of emission measurement, can have an enormous impact on the political viability of a carbon emissions market. And I think he puts the contribution of STS to public administration of disaster well when he writes, "Successful intervention is a techno-political matter. It must be politically viable, but it must also be materially effective, and its efficacy is a matter of its apparent detail as well as its technical features." And I think this classic STS point holds true across the essays in the volume, whether the authors are discussing the provision of AIDS drugs in the global south and the need for reform of intellectual property law, the relationship between NGOs and private military firms in contexts of humanitarian emergency, or the organization of disaster response in the US. Upon reflection, this attempt to innovate in multiple ways in public administration discussions on disaster management may, as I suggested earlier, have been overly ambitious, especially considering the series' goal of targeting key policy and opinion makers who may not have the time or inclination to interrogate the construction of the category of disaster or to reconceptualize the relation between the social and the technical. In which case, I think the volume would have to find its own public. Part of the reason we're having a launch here. And I want to leave it now to Alan to comment on the success or failure of the volume to achieve these various formal and substantive goals.
Thank you. Thanks, Andy. Should I just run straight on? Yeah. So I'll say thank you to all the organisers. Sheila mentioned at the beginning that groups of people in the States and in the UK are watching this on stream, but I want to say that probably only in Denmark is there a streaming party taking place at this moment. So I kind of hope they're not having more fun their party than we are here, but I just want to tell people who are watching this by stream, we're having a pretty wild time here. So you're really missing out. So I'm going to organise, and also when I was putting my thoughts down, I didn't realise, Andy, that the book was $10. And so working at a business school, of course, you should calibrate my remarks to take account that I thought it was a $30. I'll just kind of adjust. But seriously, I'm not actually going to work through the book and offer a sustained commentary. Instead, I'm going to use it to reflect a little bit more broadly on what you might call the public role of STS, which I know we're going to return to later. So I've structured my comments around 3 different points. What does this book tell us about how we are to think about disasters, on the argument that I think very often the most powerful contribution that social science or STS can ever make is by altering those frames of thinking. I've always found that much more powerful than any particular specific prescription. The second thing I'll cluster comments around will be what significant themes emerged for what I'll call engaged but critical social science. And the third thing I'll cluster the comments around will be, what does this suggest for the politics and policy of intervention? So thinking about disasters, what kind of picture emerges? And Andy's already suggested some aspects of this. But I was very struck as I was panicking slightly 10 days or so ago, trying to organise my thoughts, that one of the British newspapers, The Guardian, the Saturday before last, had a colour supplement called 2011, A Year of Disasters. And of course, it's very early in 2011 to be labelling this a year of disasters, but there's something very powerful about these images of disaster, and The Guardian featured really moving, stunning pictures of floods, of earthquakes, of landslides. And so Andy mentioned the sociology of disasters and some of the taken for granted assumptions within this, but rather like arguments about how we move beyond reductionist models of science. We have to recognise that the way disasters precisely are portrayed, and The Guardian is a very thoughtful newspaper in general, is very different from the way in which social scientists tend to talk about these things. The idea of these events as taking place beyond the everyday, the idea of them as representing a very strong external threat. And if you saw, as I'm sure you did, those amazing pictures, stunning, horrible pictures of the tsunami and its impact on Japan, it was very hard to see that as anything other than something beyond the social, as the tsunami swept aside all of the dignified conditions of everyday life. And also when there is that conventional portrayal of disasters, increasingly the model is indeed of them being bound up with expert systems. And thinking about the situation in Fukushima, and I'm sure it wasn't the only person in the room who was desperately listening to expert prognostications around what was happening in the reactor, trying somehow to find someone who can make sense of these things, some sort of expert voice who could help us explain. It reminded me very much of the aftermath of 3 Mile Island, where a similar thing was occurring, of listening to experts trying to explain what was happening inside the plant at Harrisburg, although many of them, off camera so to say, admitted that actually they had very little idea. So the way in which these events are portrayed as beyond the everyday, as being external, is increasingly bound up with expert systems, is very profoundly challenged in this very nice, very interesting, very worthwhile book. Because what you see coming through in terms of these accounts of accidents is the normality of accidents, their embeddedness in ways of life. And one of the most powerful examples in the book is the case of sufferers and those coping with HIV/AIDS, and the enormous difference which wealth makes in that situation. Is I think it's Klug says that it's either a manageable condition or it's a death sentence, and where you stand on that can easily be seen is largely a matter of, do you have the conditions, does your country have the conditions to purchase the drugs? In this perspective also, disasters and disaster planning become, an extrapolation into the future, to use Sheila Jasanoff's phrase, a screen which we fill with our hopes and our fears. And certainly very broadly, Sheila's chapter, but several chapters also, present risk and risk disasters as overflowing epistemological, ontological boundaries. And boundaries, of course, which are still there, embedded in the famous distinction between risk analysis as a scientific act and risk management is a matter of decision-making. The chapters in various ways challenge that. But also, and I think this is very distinctive, and perhaps Andy didn't stress this so much, the chapters have a very strong theme in terms of the interpenetration of governmental and market approaches. There's a very nice story which Andy wrote right at the beginning about firefighters. It's in Southern California, isn't it, where the fires are occurring and a private firefighting company pushes through the boundaries to save houses which have taken out private cover. So that idea of private firefighters going where normal governmental firefighters raises many issues. And the book has numerous examples of that, of private firefighters, I say, of defense contractors working for humanitarian organizations, this awkward juxtaposition of humanitarian organizations with their culture hiring private military contractors to allow them to do their work in highly dangerous parts of the world. Or Donald Mackenzie writing about new market mechanisms for climate change. So what themes emerge for what I called before critical but engaged scholarship? And I use that phrase because Van der Ven's category of engaged scholarship is a term which gets picked up again and again within the business school area, which I also work in. But critical meaning that it's always important when looking at these areas to use one of the simple STS ideas of it could be different. There's always a possibility of things being other than the way in which they're presented. Well, let me just pick out three of those kind of themes. And it's a real problem of choice because there are so many that I could pick. The first is certainly the relationship between disaster, politics, and the market. Something which I think, again, will be discussed later in this meeting, but an area which traditionally STS hasn't been strong, but in which it has become very strong over recent years, the relationship between knowledge and the market. In this book, you've got actually two, if I just pick on two, very interesting accounts of the relationship between disaster, politics, and the market. The one is Klug's treatment of intellectual property regimes, which you already heard mentioned, in the context of the slow disaster of HIV/AIDS. There's something very powerful about the way in which Klug represents the market is, so to say, getting in the way. The regimes around intellectual property getting in the way of people's rights to access to the products of science and technology. So here you have a very negative and troublesome account, although one with pointers for the future too. But then you also have Donald Mackenzie in the same book writing about carbon emission trading in Europe, in terms which I read as much more optimistic, the idea that the market could actually be beneficial in those situations, in the sense that markets do not necessarily have corrosive effects. But the way I read his account of carbon emission trading in Europe, it seemed to me to suggest significant potential for the future, that this could in some way, although we haven't seen it fully yet, not be a disaster in itself, but something which would allow us to move forward. And then in the book, in terms of the relationship between disaster politics and the market, you also have an interesting juxtaposition of natural crises and financial crises. It's hard to think of the financial crisis as a disaster in the same way, but to think about that interrelationship again stretches social science, stretches STS in particular, to consider relationships which we often ignore. The second theme which comes out in the book is around systemic risk and the science of disasters. Now, this is traditionally a very strong area for STS, so it's not hard to see this represented here. The idea of a pathology of failure in these cases, challenges in the direction of the democratic governance of complex systems. Again and again, the book returns to a very important theme, which is the frames of meaning which become imposed in these situations, what these often technicist frames include but also exclude. So Sheila, for example, contrasts managerial and participatory approaches to understanding the 2004 tsunami. And then the third theme, which I think is one which we need to consider very seriously, is STS and social science searching for new regulatory and organizational forms. This isn't a particular domain of STS, but the question of what kinds of institutions are required in these new conditions. On the one hand, globalizing forces, and at the same time, the interpenetration of markets with areas traditionally reserved for government, raises questions of, for example, how can we identify and explore technical and political institutions capable of building some sort of sustainable resistance? What political norms should be applied to non-state institutions? We seem to think that automatically different norms should be applied to governments opposed to the private sector. But why would that be? What happens when private military contractors are part of the work of humanitarian organizations? By what standards should we then judge them? So what does all this suggest for the politics, or let me say the technopolitics, and policy of intervention, and specifically for the role of STS? Well, we talked about swamps before. I was going to use a different idea, the idea of borderlands. It seems to me that something which Marilyn Strathern has particularly discussed. The book seems to me to open up in a way which doesn't follow any clear disciplinary boundary at all, which I must say I rather like. The idea that we don't have to always declare ourselves in disciplinary terms. The book certainly opens up the responsibility, the challenge, the confusion, the opportunity of working across borderlands. And certainly you can see social scientists in this area working with activists and community organizers, planners and developers, residents and managers, scientists and other social scientists. But one of the things that really interested me in that situation, reading the chapters and reading the accounts, is to say, well, what then does it mean for the social? How then, in these kind of circumstances, can we define society or the social at all? Marilyn Strathern, the anthropologist, says, in such circumstances as these, working on the borderlines, social scientists might want to think very carefully about just how they are to speak for society. So it strikes me that in these interdisciplinary accounts, the ability to summon up something of the social becomes highly problematized. I would see that as a provocation to social science rather than a problem. Certainly I see it as an opportunity for renewal. But in this context, and Andy, I'm sure will have comments about this, it does raise questions, that was a hint to you, about, well, what then is distinctive about the social scientific voice in these cases of such strong interdisciplinarity? The second thing I want to pick out from the book, which comes across very clearly, and again we've touched upon a couple of times already, is the way in which the book has a very interesting way of bringing other words into the discussion. The words of disaster response and disaster management, as we conventionally hear them, typically don't use words like ethics, something we've talked about welfare, about choice, in the terms of the risk equation. Sheila uses a nice expression, the upward spiral of inclusion, and the possibilities for that within disaster preparedness. And I think one of the words which I noticed very much was the word dignity, which came in several occasions in terms of the book's discussion, imposing a word like dignity in a context where so often we use the language of risk. And certainly, from my own experience, the way in which people experience disasters, New Orleans, compared, for example, to cases in Europe like the Elbe floods, the way in which dignity is handled from the people who are coping with those disasters has profound repercussions. When the Elbe flooding occurred in Germany, I was very struck by the principle that the authorities used, which was that no one's life should be worse off as a consequence of the flooding. As soon as you come in with that idea that people will be treated in that kind of way, you have a completely different relationship between the authorities and the people concerned. But of course, in talking about ethics and talking about those things, we also have to look at the negative side of this. The Guardian that I referred to right at the beginning, when it talked about 2011, the year of disaster, said, are we to blame? So the politics of blame in these situations, the way in which blaming is attributed, is something which the book doesn't explore in quite the same way as it uses positive words like ethics, welfare, and dignity. It seems to me that blame and blame avoidance are also very powerful actors in this area, and that's something which social scientists also have to reckon with. In other words, institutions which can be represented as extremely strong and powerful in terms of controlling these issues can also be represented as extremely weak and passive because precisely of a concern about the attribution of blame in the wake of a nuclear accident or flood disaster response. And we've certainly seen this in the Western newspapers in their comments on the Japanese tsunami, the way in which journalists are looking to blame the Japanese authority. The third thing I will just pick out, and it seems to me a challenge which runs through the book, is, well, I guess one way of trying to get this transition is to talk about the movement between risk management or disaster management and governance to processes of managing and governing in these kind of situations. What kind of processes, what sort of systems can bring resilience and sustainability? What particularly happens once we move beyond criticizing existing institutions towards saying, well, how then do we think different? How then could it be other? It seems to me that one of the requirements in this area is to think of institutions which are capable of mitigation or disaster anticipation and response without exact calculation. But as soon as we start to move into that territory, we have to be aware that familiar sources of authority start to break down. So in thinking about this interpenetration of governments and markets, we also have to think about the processes involved and the kinds of rationale, the kinds of justification, the kinds of authority which can be summoned up in these sorts of situations. So there I think I'm going to finish, except just to emphasize the fact that what one gets reading this book is a sense of disaster and disaster response, not as some kind of special area, something dedicated to a sociology of the sociology of disaster or particular area of technical governance, but is raising much more wide issues. I think we can see coming through this book that the response, the understanding, the anticipation of disasters isn't just a matter of the specialist debate, but it's a major challenge to 21st century governance. And I think that's a tribute to the authors, and it's also a tribute to the ways of thinking of social scientists, that they're able to, on the one hand, focus on something as specific and as powerful as a disaster, but at the same time bring out the sense of otherness, the sense of alternative possibilities which are embedded in cases like that. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for your quick and rich comments on a thin book about a very serious set of topics. I would like to open the floor. I think many of you would like to speak immediately. I already see Clark lined up behind the microphone.
Thank you both very much. I thought both the book and Alan, your comments on it were very interesting and helpful for a contemplation of disaster in the modern condition. But, and Alan, maybe this is a little bit unfair, especially given your last two sentences, but you kept talking about in these circumstances. In circumstances like these, and I took that to be part of a larger challenge, it seems to me, that STS can bring to how we think about disasters. In terms of, we understand disaster as a space not just where public administration is practiced, but where it's failed. In the sense that every disaster in the modern context plays out in a way which is structured in part by the forces that create the disaster, but also in part by the social and the technological landscapes that have been built before the disaster occurs. And it seems to me that there is a point where your last sentences actually really come home, because disasters then become not moments of exception from the practice of public administration, but something which is endemic to every minute of public administration in contemporary societies. Because that administration is shaping the landscapes, both social and technological, that are being built constantly. And I think one thing that this does is it takes natural disasters out of a context which is different from technological disasters, economic disasters, social disasters, etc., in terms of the way we think about it. And it makes it harder both to think about natural disasters as simply something which is caused by an external force and creates an exception to the normal conditions of social order. But it also makes it harder, therefore, to use that kind of logic to talk about economic disasters, social disasters, which we do in public administration. And we saw this extensively with the discussions around the 2008 collapse of the economy, the discussions around 9/11, and so forth. But these were somehow the results of complex, dynamic, unpredictable activities that were very naturalized in much of the discussion of these things. Second thing it does is it forces us to look at the ways that we operate within these public administration spaces. So, for example, looking at the way in which, as Andrew talked about it earlier, knowledge gets produced, circulated, validated, appropriated, and used in public administration contexts becomes a central factor for understanding how and why the particular disasters that occur not only occur when they occur, but also take the shape and form that they do, which then understood in that way, and if we were to begin to do analyses, for example, of the ways in which existing knowledge systems, if you want to talk about it that way, formulated problems in such a fashion that it led to this landscape being built and therefore this kind of disaster occurring. That can help us understand how public administration practices might be reformed to try to approach these kinds of challenges, which are really endemic challenges of complex, highly systematized socio-technological landscapes. And so it seems to me that STS actually is a quite rich set of tools to bear, not just on the moments of disaster, but on the whole ways in which disasters appear out of the kinds of systems and frameworks and technologies and sociologies that we are imagining and creating through our public spheres all the time. Thanks.
Would you like to comment right away?
Sure.
I guess just a couple of words. That I agree with what you said, and I think it's helpful in clarifying the somewhat more narrow aims of the pieces in this volume, because they're actually not, for the most part, diagnoses of the causes of disaster, which indeed I agree with. That there's systemic long-term quality, but rather, for the most part, fairly modest and pragmatic attempts to prospectively design. We might call them technologies of humility, or protocols, standards that would increase resilience against various kinds of future disaster, and also that don't a priori just take a side in a debate between public and market logics, but that actually may ask the question. It's not a question necessarily of government versus the market, but rather what kind of market might one construct. This actually is a preview of the next section. But are there insights from STS that help us understand the kind of market devices one could construct that would mitigate future disasters prospectively?
But I mean, just to say, one of the obvious factors in terms of looking at these situations is the acknowledgement of uncertainty within those systems. And you're quite right in what you say about the systemic character, but it's as soon as we see the situation in Fukushima and the fact that all sorts of assumptions have been made, as we've heard the story very much before in the development of technology, which now become challenged because events were greater than had previously been anticipated, a big alarm bell starts to ring in terms of, well, where is the acknowledgement of uncertainty? And perhaps this isn't, and here's a familiar story of STS, just a matter of the expert analyses of these characters, but of these situations, but also the way in which those expert analyses transport themselves into the public policy. And as a European, the BSE, the mad cow disease crisis, is the kind of locus classicus of that sort of problem. So it seems that this idea of the need for critical scrutiny, I mean, again, it's a very powerful argument from STS, is a recurrent element, because how else can you maintain awareness of uncertainty? But also a challenge to the construction of complex systems built on unreasonable optimism certainly seems to keep occurring in the nuclear case.
Yeah, Trevor Pinch, Cornell. First of all, thanks for the book, Andy. I haven't read it, but now I know it only costs $10. I do intend to read it. I want to ask a question that's possibly unfair, but I was thinking of two other books in disasters that come from a rather different perspective, mainly from the sociology of organisation. Chick Perot's book, Normal Accidents, and Diane Vaughan's book on the space shuttle accident. Now, the Challenger accident. It seems to me that one of the merits of those two books, and they're both kind of inadequate in terms of STS, and we often criticise those books for some of the STS in those books, but they both predicted the sorts of accidents that might happen in the future. As you know, Chick Perot was on the Three Man Island Commission, and he predicted basically the Chernobyl accident, that sort of normal accident in an uncontained building, he said specifically. And Diane Vaughan, to some extent, predicted there'd be another space shuttle accident because of the culture of safety at NASA and so on. So from this book, I know it's an unfair question, but are there any predictions or anything you could point to, say, that we as a society, we're interested in policy, could take from this in terms of one of the things about disasters, they are so specific, a particular type of accident, a particular type of disaster we could be looking for? I know it's unfair.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's no effort to predict future disasters. Probably it might be better put to anticipate future disasters is what the authors are after. Let me just give you one example, and this ties back to I guess my prior response around creating resilient technologies of resilience. I think that probably from reading Donald Mackenzie's piece on can you hear me okay? From reading Donald Mackenzie's piece on the design of a European emissions market, you can probably predict what would lead it to fail. That is, if certain questions around political viability are not very carefully integrated into the technical instruments that are used to design the market, for example, how you measure emissions, then it's quite likely that this cap and trade system would fail. So that I guess that level of prediction might be, or diagnosis is available.
But I like Trevor's question very much, and it all, of course, depends on prediction. But you can take two examples from the book. I think it's actually very strong at this. One is the relationship between intellectual property regimes and HIV/AIDS, and the other one is the relationship between private military contractors and humanitarian organizations. Now, whether you, first of all, take HIV/AIDS, I mean, is it a disaster? Is it a silent disaster? It's happening now already, so it isn't actually a prediction. But you could certainly see an argument which says that there are important consequences in terms of human life and suffering from the way in which intellectual property regimes work right now. And on the private military contractors idea, it's very, very interesting that we don't hear more about that problematic relationship between ex-soldiers and humanitarian organizations working so closely together. Clearly there's going to be problems at some point around that relationship. So it's not prediction in the sense, the classical sense, but perhaps that's where social science often is in these kind of situations, pointing to things which are happening now with longer term consequences.
Is there time for one more?
Next on the list was Fujiki.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Sorry. My name is Yuko Fujigaki from University of Tokyo. I come to this conference from Japan just after 4 weeks. 4 weeks after a terrific disaster, earthquake, tsunami, and accident of nuclear power plants. A Japanese government, Council for Science and Technology Policy, asked Japanese STS members to input STS perspective for the revision of the fourth Science and Technology Basic Plan, considering the effect of disasters. So, what do you advise us, Japanese STS colleagues, based on your book?
No, she definitely said based on your books. I heard her say that.
You have to raise the price of the
this, I mean, I certainly will not deign to offer advice, but I guess it's an opportunity to mention one other piece of the book that I think ties together the different chapters, which is the question, a term that was initially raised in the context of financial crisis, but that is clearly applicable to the various sorts of disasters discussed in the book, as well as to the unfolding disasters in Japan, which is the term systemic risk, and how one might diagnose systemic risk and devise methods for mitigating systemic risk. And you know, this gets broadly into the question of how you integrate a norm of resilience, technical and social resilience, into your disaster planning or vulnerability assessment apparatuses that you're building.
But I just make one comment. I mean, back to Fukushima. I mean, there is something horribly familiar in terms of the response to that, the way in which it's presented, and the likely analyses that are coming. So one very simple scholarly responsibility is to point to the history of these kind of incidents, to say, you know, those of us who've been around long enough can hear all sorts of analogies to previous events, which actually institutions generally ignore, that it's generally seen as a one-off incident in its own terms. So certainly putting this into a broader context of the development of that particular technology and the kinds of discussions which have happened previously, to me is incredibly informative in those sorts of contexts. There just isn't an institutional memory in most of these cases. But it's a very important question.
Maybe we can collect a couple of questions because I feel there's a great demand for asking questions.
Sure. Janet Bertessi, Princeton University. Thanks. It's really exciting to hear this discussed here. I wanted to take a page from an earlier conversation and talk a little bit about construction of disasters from below, because it seems like this is still very much a conversation of from above, or from governmental responses and larger socio-technical assemblages. But of course, one of the things we've seen in the disasters that you've mentioned in the last 5 years is an extraordinary socio-technical assemblage assembled from below. For example, the Twitter feeds, the web forums, the Facebook pages, and the dramatic response not only from the outside to these disasters, but also and especially from people who are affected by these disasters, and as they appropriate or change or challenge a narrative that's given to them from above and construct that from below using these other kinds of devices. So I'm wondering if there isn't an opportunity there also for science and technology studies analysts, what your approach to that would be, or what you would suggest that would be, and if this presents a possible site of analysis in disaster studies and STS. Thanks.
Sheila?
Yeah, I just wanted to amplify on the question that Trevor asked and get your reactions to how else one might respond to that. So if we get caught up in saying that the predicted value of our studies is when and where we see other disasters forthcoming, are we not buying into the very kinds of technical methodologies that we say are not the ones that we should be putting all our eggs into the basket of? There was, Trevor, an interesting bit of anticipation or prediction in the very fact that my article is in this book, because it was actually written before the book came into being and was published before the book came into being, and Andy grabbed it as having predicted where he was wishing his book to go, and asked if I would republish it in that context. So, taking that as a sort of slightly jokey intervention, it's nevertheless a point that the STS scholars have been making, that the consequences of disaster unfold very differently depending on the place where the vulnerability conditions were built in the first place. So that if you create a high risk in material, physical, biological terms activity against the backdrop of extreme inequality, you're going to increase the total burden of misery in that place. We have lots and lots of examples, and the one that I've been writing about for 25 years now is Bhopal, but I think it's a paradigm case of exactly that sort of thing. So in terms of anticipation, preparedness, and so on and so forth, is it not part of the mission not just to say how exactly the next set of accidents will unfold, therefore loose or tight coupling inside of the industry or organizational forgetfulness within any kind of complex organization or the normalization of deviance within any organizational or social structure, but also going back to that word context that Andy Jewett actually put on the table in connection with intellectual history, that the very thinking about disaster has to be sensitized to the social, political, economic context in which bad events come into being and unfold. And indirectly, this may actually lead back to Yuko's question, because Japan is a pretty interesting, quote, case, unquote, from the standpoint of classical disaster studies, because it is not, prey to the same kinds of inequalities as beset some of these other extraordinary population-wide disasters. And I think that Japan is also an extraordinarily resilient society in that everybody there has been brought up with an expectation that things might go wrong. So I think that the kinds of questions that one would ask in Japan might not be the same technologies of humility, but different technologies of humility, and may have to do with more questions about participation, openness, transparency, and how one actually delegates trustworthiness to bodies that are claiming to make certain kinds of judgments for other people.
Who would like to go first?
I'm just looking at Andy. Okay, you read that first last time. I think Janet's point about construction of disasters from below is extremely interesting. I was watching a lot of the early reports from Japan on CNN, and they endlessly irritated me by interviewing people in the Tokyo suburbs, and they said, well, I haven't seen my mum for 2 days, but I think she's okay, but I'm going to go down the shop soon to get some water, and there's no cars moving outside. And I thought, oh, come on, can't we have an expert to tell us what's happening here? Because, one can understand the everyday conditions of human life, but there's a way in which the news seizes on these stories from below, because there simply isn't anything else that they can possibly have to say. So there's something about the way in which disasters get constructed, and clearly they're open to multiple constructions, from the teenage girl at home wondering about when the shops are going to open again, or when cars are going to be moving outside, which of course is part of the tragedy of these things as well, the way it shakes up people's lives, to the images of tsunami waters sweeping mercilessly across open countryside. So what the stories from below to me open up is, on the one hand, the need for some kind of coherent frameworks, because simply having lots of stories from below makes it very hard for us to make any sense of what's happening whatsoever. I mean, that's just a comment and not a criticism. And the way in which then what constitutes a disaster can be framed in different ways. So certainly opening up the stories from below has the very beneficial effect of bringing other stories than the expert stories, but it's also a challenge to sense-making in those sorts of situations. I think the thing about predictability is very interesting indeed for STS and social science. I mean, I still think it's a very interesting question to ask. I like Trevor's question in that sense, because it's a challenge to us as social scientists to think differently in the way we normally do. It's an experiment. It's not necessarily, although I can see what Sheila's pointing to buy into certain reductionist and causal models. But I think it is quite an interesting challenge. And there are examples from STS where, for example, we can point to the way in which reductionist systems are peculiarly vulnerable to what they consider to be the unexpected, and we can generalize across that in different situations. So I think the notion of prediction is quite an interesting challenge. We have to see it in an appropriate fashion. But it's certainly, one can see, just to take that very simple case again of the nuclear one, that these things will happen, these stories will be repeated, and that authorities in other countries will not be tuned into these lessons. And there I feel a responsibility as a social scientist to do what Brian said earlier and just say it as we see it.
I guess the question I'll address that I think links Janet and Sheila's at least has to do with, and actually I forgot your name. is the extent to which and how STS would want to be or could be wrapped up into a broader technocratic preparedness apparatus. And I guess I would say certainly the insights from people like Vaughan, Harrow, and others, as well as work on bottom-up forms of preparedness and response, are already very much integrated into forms of disaster management and planning. So it's already happening, and in some ways, when I described what I was trying to do with this volume was to do something different from the existing literature in the sociology of disaster that I think does that quite well, and rather to reflect on the construction of the category of disaster such that very disparate kinds of events with very different temporalities can potentially be folded into a shared preparedness and response apparatus. And I guess this is maybe the quality of engaged in critical scholarship that's going on in this book, which is perhaps to try to resist and insist on specification of the sort of event and the place one's talking about.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry that I can't take Joan and Uli. Joan maybe can use her introductory marks in the next session for a hidden response. I would just like to sum up this session very quickly in the sense, by tying back to the first two sessions, that I think this discussion shows that STS may matter even in the context of analyzing and dealing with disaster, but that at the same time two, I think, significant questions have been brought up. And part of this, in what ways might also disasters help to reframe rights or even legal principles, such as the precaution principle or others, in context of trying to deal with a vast set of vulnerabilities and attempts at creating new ways of protecting and creating resilience. And thus, as regards the predictive capacities, also how could we try and enhance anticipatory capacities with regard to drawing late lessons from early warnings, to also tie back to an important report that was written about 10 years ago, ranging the time from like 1890 to 2000. Okay.